I've got a pile of clothes that need some sewing fixes and some may be out of my wheelhouse, but I'm going to try my best, so let's get to it. So this first one is actually a really simple, very small issue, and it's that the collar of this is just way too big, especially as a hijabi. I always have to constantly cover it or readjust it or wear something under it, and I'm not dealing with that anymore. And what's even crazier is that it was more open than it is now. I actually sewed 2 inches of it already, but it is still way too big. So what I want to do is make it accessible because my head has to get through the hole and I want it to close, so I am going to use a little metal fastener. I actually don't know if that's what these are called, but they have been in my sewing kit since probably before I was born. It's been a generational passed down, something that my mom got from Syria, but I am going to use them because they are phenomenal for making little invisible buttons and closures on items. To attach them, I am just going to hand sew them on. They kind of have these holes similar to buttons, and you just keep alternating in each hole until it feels extremely secure. The most difficult part about this is making sure that both sides are lined up so you don't have little loops or bumps in your fabric when you do go to button it up. So I had to make sure I lined it up and then I marked the spot that I wanted to put the button in and then sewed it in exactly in that spot. I also realized that if I sewed it in that front fabric, it would totally be visible. So I had to make sure to only sew in the back fabric, which was kind of difficult because it's literally a metal fastener kind of pushing the needle around, but eventually I made it work. After I tested out the fastener, I realized there is definitely a lump. However, putting the dress on, I can confirm that it's not bad. It actually just works with the shape of my body and isn't going to show anything. I could have probably gone with a second fastener, but these are liquid gold in my house and I did not want to waste it on this project. But this is the final look. It is definitely looking exactly the same as before, but if you look close up, obviously there's that fastener. I'm actually very excited for this one because this is my go-to casual dress and I'm very excited for it to actually be comfortable. The last one was simple, and this one is also simple. You can see that this dress looks normal and it has a good collar. You know, my collar isn't going to show under my hijab, but my issue with this one is its sleeves. These sleeves are just open, but the way that they sit, they end up dipping in things or getting in the way, and I just want to add some elastic to it so that they scrunch up and mind their business and stop touching everything I try to grab. I actually have to do this quite often, so I've got all the supplies I need. I just have this very thin elastic and then a seam ripper, and I just rip a very small portion of the seam, just enough to be able to stuff the safety pin and the elastic in there. Next, I will measure the elastic. Usually I will wrap it around my wrist and then cut it right where it feels a little tight, but also a little loose. That way you're not cutting circulation, but it's also doing the job that it needs to do. And then you'll see here, I accidentally cut it way too short. I don't know what I was thinking. However, I do end up using this without rechecking the measurements, which is so crazy. Also, I cut 2 of them. You'll find out in a bit that I realized my mistake after I finished the complete process. But to thread the elastic through the sleeve, I went ahead and attached a safety pin to one end, and then I stuffed it in the hole that I created in the sleeve, and then I just kept going until I made it all the way around the cuff, and I made sure to grab the tail end so that it didn't go in and get lost in the middle of the cuff. And once I had threaded it all the way through, I used my safety pin to just grab the second end, that way it doesn't accidentally go back in, and then I will grab my thread and needle so that I can sew everything shut. However, this is when I go to test out the sleeve and realize, this will definitely cut my circulation. So I had to go back and redo the process. This time when I cut the elastic, I'm going to double and triple check that it actually is the right size. And now going back to the sleeve that I made incorrectly, I'm going to remove the elastic. Ideally, this would have been a situation where I could save the elastic and use it for something else. However, this elastic is way too tiny to be used in another project. So to remove it, I am just going to find any part of it, cut it, and then pull it out of the sleeve. And then I'm going to repeat these same steps with these new elastics to thread them through, then secure them, and then I will sew the cuff shut. So normally with sewing the cuff shut, you would use the same color thread. However, I do not have this olive green, so I am going to use black, and I am going to just follow the stitch marks from the previous stitches and just match them up. Or I would ideally have done this on the sewing machine, but I just did not feel like pulling that out today. And I know my sewing skills are not good, and this is a thread that does not match. However, I did make sure to do it on the inside of the cuff so it was less noticeable. Once the first cuff was complete, I went ahead and repeated the process on the second one, and with that, the dress is complete. And this is what it is looking like. Again, it looks exactly like what it started with, but the upgrades are in the details, those being the cuffs. You can see here, these are a lot more tailored and not going to be dragging in whatever I touch. And with that, I am very happy. So this right here is another thrift find, except this time we are doing a dramatic change. This is like a swim cover up, but you can see it's got this beautiful ruffle and it is a fantastic fabric to make a pottery apron with, or at least something that I can wear during pottery so that I don't splash my pants and my outfit. The plan is to just cut off the top bralette part and then just make it a skirt, because all I really need is to cover my bottom half when I'm at the wheel. So to start this project off, I'm essentially going to seam rip every single part of this. I'm just going to separate the top and the bottom half and then also remove the ruffles. This took forever. I mean, I watched a couple episodes of my favorite show, but eventually you can see I removed the elastic, I removed the ruffles, I removed the top half, and now I've got all of my pieces and it's time to assemble. My goal was to use the ruffles and the elastic to essentially make a waistband, and so right now I am just measuring out and you can see that it actually was the perfect amount. So after I measured it all out, I went ahead and just started to pin everything in place. So the plan is to first sew all of the ruffles in so that all of the edges have that, and then I'm going to sew the elastic on, and then I'm going to fold the fabric over to hide the elastic and then sew it again so that also the ruffles will stick outward. And once everything was pinned in place, I brought it over to my sewing station so that I could use my sewing machine to sew everything in place. I'm going to be honest, this is about 1 or 2 weeks later and I finally managed the courage to sew everything, and this is me trying to figure out what the heck I had done the week before. But once I figured it out, I went ahead and grabbed my sewing machine and got to work. Well, actually, I procrastinated a little bit because this is the part of the project where things are starting to come together and I get a little anxious and nervous that it's not going to work. But I mustered up the courage and now it is time to just sew all of those ruffles in. I just used a straight stitch and just went for it. Wait. This is the part where I decided to scare myself because I started to contemplate my choices. I put right sides together. See, if I had done this all in one day, I would have remembered that I put right sides together because I wanted the ruffles to stick out a bit. However, at this point in time, I was like, I actually want them to point inward. But I ended up going with it because I did not feel like seam ripping everything. It also took me about half an hour before I discovered my new friend, Pimple Mountain. I then worked to figure out how I wanted to get the elastic set up. So what I was going to do is sew the elastic into the seam allowance and then fold it over and sew again. So I went to grab my straight pins and then this happened. Oh, I knew that was gonna happen and I still put them there. I am such an idiot. How do you... Oh, it's right here. Yeah, so lesson learned, crisis averted. I will not be putting pins on top of my machine ever again. With that past us, I went back to sewing the elastic in. I'm going to start with the base stitches so that it is secure, and then I am going to stretch the elastic as I go. That way, when all of it is complete, it will be in a tighter version than it is when it's sewn. And this sounds a lot easier than it was because there are 3 layers that you have to make sure are going through the sewing machine, and I accidentally sewed through the other side of the skirt. And listen, it happens to the best of us, or at least that's what I'm going to tell myself, because I could have easily avoided this by checking my fabric before pressing the on button. And you know, no worries, it's just a small mistake. I'll grab my seam ripper and I'll just undo all of it. But of course, to add the cherry on top, I lost my seam ripper. Luckily, I found it and I went ahead and undid everything and went back to sewing the elastic in. And once the elastic was complete, you're like, yes, she's done. She's accomplished it, right? Wrong. Okay, after this, I was like, ooh, I definitely need to try this on. So I went ahead and tried it on and I realized that it does not fit. I don't know why, because it fit me before all of my DIYing and it is still the same amount of fabric with the same elastics, but look at how big it is. So I'm going to go ahead and sew that, just sew straight down the skirt, and then I am going to cut off the excess. I started by pinning it to mark how much I wanted removed. I then took the skirt off and then just went for it. I honestly should have measured, placed pins, but at this point I was so fed up. I had had so many hiccups. I was like, you know what? It is way too early in the morning to be dealing with this and to make it accurate, especially since it's just a pottery apron that is just going to get dirty and beaten up. And honestly, no regrets because it ended up working out perfectly. So after that, I tried it on again to make sure I didn't make it too tight and to make sure it actually fit. And thankfully it did. So I went ahead and looked for fabric scissors and only managed these little tiny blue ones that come with the sewing machine, but they're sharp. And so I went ahead and very slowly removed all of the excess fabric. And tell me why I looked at these scraps and went, oh, I could make a skirt for my cat. My cat hates me enough. I don't need to give him another reason for that, but I went ahead and started to sew in the extra channel to just hide the elastic, and after that the skirt was complete. This has been the biggest transformation so far. It went from a dress to a skirt, and it is going to be perfect for my pottery since it is a waterproof material. This is what that little channel for the elastic is looking like, and it works so well. This is another thrift find and another dramatic change. I want to turn this dress into a skirt that I can layer with other sweaters and with other dresses. You can see down here it has this beautiful ruffling that I'm obsessed with. So what I'm going to do is basically what I did with the last dress. And I'm just going to chop off the top half, keep the little tie situation, and then just make it into a skirt. So this sounds a lot easier than it was to execute. My first idea was to cut enough seam allowance from the shirt part of it to just fold it over and sew, but that would leave a really weird edge. So then I was like, let me just cut it with a seam allowance and then see what can happen or what I can do with it from there. And let me tell you, that was a mistake. I should have thought this through before bringing the scissors to the fabric, but hey, it's a little too late, and I realized that after I cut everything because my hands kind of failed me and I did not cut as big of a seam allowance as I wanted. Regardless, I did try to fold it over and sew, but there were some spots that were just way too short, and if I had tried to use the sewing machine in those areas, it would have sewn into the channel created for the little belt. So I decided to experiment and kind of go away from sewing and more into DIYing. I decided to bring out the blue scissors that started this all and cut even more of that seam allowance off. I was actually just going to cut it all off so that there was barely any fabric left, and then I was going to use some fire to melt the edges. Now this would work perfectly because the mesh that this is made of is that one that just frays so easily, so not only would it secure all of these strings in place, but it would also just hide the edge that I was afraid I would get when sewing. And once I tested it out, I was actually really happy with the results, so I grabbed out my DIY candle. I mean, you can see there were threads in there. This is what I use for my sewing projects that need this, but I went ahead and lit the candle, and then I just slowly took the edge of the fabric and just took it across there and just watched all of the strings melt. I did have to be very careful not to accidentally burn the fabric or to leave any of the strings unmelted, or else they would fray. And I just went the whole way around the skirt, and honestly this was a lot more fun than sewing. And once it was complete, I went ahead and put the candle out because last time I didn't. I accidentally burnt a plant, but then I tried the skirt on and it actually fit so well, especially with the belt on the side. It just looked really good. I was so happy with how this skirt turned out and to be done with these DIYs that I did a little happy dance walk around my room. And now for the befores and afters. It is such an amazing transformation. I'm obsessed and I can't wait to wear this with all of its ruffles and its cute little tie. I am so proud of all of my accomplishments with these guys, and I am very excited to add them back into my collection and to wear them again.